Great.
Awesome.
All right, what's going on, everyone? I want to welcome Josh Tyler to the Mission Driven Made podcast. Thank you for being on the show today, man.
Hey, my pleasure. Really, really excited to get to know you a little bit better, have a conversation, and talk to your folks, and hopefully, they'll come away with something useful.
Oh, they absolutely will. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to have more athletes and entrepreneurs on the show. So
Okay.
You fit both of those. So they are very much looking forward to this.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah. And so you are known for being a pro MMA fighter, and then also your brand that you found, obviously, the Savage Gentleman. But before we get into that, I would love to hear about your beginning. So a little bit about your upbringing, and then how that kind of molded you into who you are. But yeah, let's start there. Let's start with the upbringing, and then we'll kind of zoom into different parts of your life.
Well, it all started back. There was a boy who met a girl, and how far back you want to go? I think one of the biggest things for me, I guess, that led me to where I am now is probably athletic endeavors. Started off playing sports and always had a dream of being a professional athlete. When I was really young, I was much more on the academic side. I mean, just like super nerdy. Like I wanted to be a scientist, and all my little friends, we'd go and we'd like hunt bugs and study stuff and just do geeky sciencey stuff. And I'm saying that not as any kind of like detriment or derogatory term towards that. It was just, that's what you called it back then, and it doesn't make it bad. It's just what it was. And it was interesting. I found so much more value, I guess, in what I was doing with sports. Like, okay, yeah, sure, I did well in school, and that was great, and you got a good little pat on the back. But getting good grades was the expectation. But if you did something outstanding in sports, oh man, wow. People really take notice of that. And I think that had a lot of intrinsic value to me as a young boy. And, you grow up watching sports. You look at these athletes and somewhat as heroes, right? And that's,
100%.
Right. And you're like, I want to be that guy. I want to be that guy that millions of people are tuning in to watch do his thing. And there was something about that spoke to me. I think, for whatever reason, that seemed to be the path that called the strongest. And so played football, but I'm not a huge guy. I was good at it, but there's not a lot of 5'7", 165 pound, kind of guy on most. It's just like, man, I just didn't have what was necessary to compete at that level in that sport. And I kept waiting for a growth spurt that just never happened. Right. And so I ended up finding wrestling, and something about that appealed to me even more so. I think because it was so much more challenging, right? Football and even baseball, I mean, they're team sports, right? And there's value in that. I think that there's good lessons to be learned, but there's something unique about individual sport, especially a combat sport, that, man, it really resonated with me. I think just because it was so difficult, and I think that's what kept me in. Is like, man, this is the hardest thing I could conceive doing. So in some weird factor so for some reason that means it must be the right thing. And I think that kind of stems from probably the work ethic that I learned from the people around me. My father, my grandfather, my mom, everybody just worked their ass off. And I saw that, and that was like the highest premium, of just working hard. And so I'm like, okay, here's a thing that makes me have to work super, super hard, and a thing that, allows me to do these really awesome, athletic endeavors. This is the path to go. Right. So I wrestled in high school. Realized that even playing football in high school, that was a kind of a dead end. So shifted focus, more wrestling. Went to Old Dominion University, Division I collegiate wrestling there for 4 years. Went through my eligibility, didn't quite get where I had hoped to in the sport, and ended up being introduced to MMA. It was funny because I was aware of the sport years and years before, but it didn't click. Like I didn't understand it. It was watching some weird, strange version of like professional wrestling that just, I'm like, yeah, I don't think that's for me. I'm gonna get to a real sport, right? It was just too new back then for me to grasp. And thankfully, some of my former teammates in college got into it, and they were like, hey man, you should check this out. It's really cool. And I was really looking to scratch that itch. And from the very first day I stepped in the doors and walked on the mat, I was like, that's it. This is the thing. And I didn't really have any ambitions of competing other than just, hey, this is fun. I need to do it. And it allows me that outlet. And that's kind of what started me on that path. I hope that answered the question that you asked.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Okay.
I want to rewind just a little bit and talk a little bit more, about wrestling.
Okay.
I didn't wrestle or anything, but some of the wrestlers seemed like some of the toughest guys like I went to high school with. And I heard this term the other day, micro adversity, and how, especially men, we need to put ourselves in kind of these physical challenges and little moments of adversity a little bit more than we do. And whenever I would see wrestlers, I would see them training really hard, or I would see them walking around there trying to make weight, and they put Jolly Ranchers in their mouth and they would spit into a water bottle. Did you guys do that too?
Oh yeah, it was ridiculous. Wrestling is something that I think is very useful, and I do recommend it, but at the same time, I caution people because there's a lot of dumb stuff that people do, and I think a lot of that stuff is being phased out. I mean, the virtue of the sport is hard enough, right? It demands a such a high level of discipline, both physically and mentally, that I think that's really good. But typical weight cutting practices, especially the way we implemented them, and sadly, I think still to this day, some people are doing a lot of stuff. It's like, hey man, you're a 14-year-old kid, bro. Like you don't. I mean, unless you are grossly overweight, you probably don't need to try and drop 20 pounds to make this weight class. And that doesn't apply to everyone, but like, hey, you're a relatively lean athletic dude, trying to force that kid to drop even 10 pounds during this period where he's supposed to be growing. I don't really recommend. I wouldn't subject my own kid to that. And even my parents kind of had like a limit of like what was reasonable and what wasn't. And I think a lot of people take that too far, and it's detrimental, right? So I would caution of that. But, I think if you've got good coaches and you've got, that have good intentions and put the safety of the kids above all else, right? I mean, yes, winning is important. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm not of the mindset of like, well, we all tried hard and we're still dear friends and that's all that matters. It's like, no, by golly, you do your best to freaking win. However, in the grand scheme of things, I can tell you right now that my life is not any better or worse from winning or losing a particular match, right? And sometimes it's hard to see that forest through the trees when you are competing. It's like, no, the only thing that matters is winning this tournament. And it's like, I've got medals that I'm not squat. You can't see it here, but I've got a freaking bookcase with trophies and awards that I've won that have put, not one single additional piece of food on my table, right? So I think perspective is important, right? Yes, winning is super important, but not at the cost of all, if that makes sense.
So the reason why everyone would cut weight is that because if you go to a lighter weight class, it's going to be easier, I guess, to succeed when you're at a lighter weight class.
So you're just trying to get as big of an advantage as you can, because it's you're competing, right?
Yeah.
And it stands, if you are a larger individual, it's going to give you an advantage. And so if all things are equal, right, in terms of skill, if you and I are competing and we are dead even in skill, but you have a little bit more mass, a
Yeah.
little bit more strength, it's going to give you some advantage, right? And so cutting weight, using water weight to manipulate that, you can kind of tilt the scale in your favor a little bit, but there's a point of diminished returns. And that the hard part about wrestling is, sometimes the best athlete isn't the guy who wins. It's often, it comes down to the guy who can cut the most weight and still perform, right? And that's not the nature of the sport. And the hard part is, and the same is true for fighting, right? In a perfect world where you just compete at your walk around weight, right? So I'm walking around, I'm probably, let's say I'm a $170 right now. So I fight at 170-pound weight class. If I was to try and compete in the UFC today at 170 pounds, I stepped on the scale, and the next fighting would probably weigh 200 pounds. Easily. He could easily weigh 200 pounds. Ooh. And I'm still at 170, right? I'm going to and not say that I couldn't ever beat that guy. But again, if skill and everything else is equal, man, I'm going to put myself at a severe disadvantage. So instead of doing that, I say, well, that's ridiculous. I'm going to drop, 50 pounds or sorry, not 50. I'm going to drop 20, 15 to 20 pounds my own self. And I'm going to go down to 155 or maybe 145. So, comparable to in size to the guy that I'm competing. And so that's where that comes from. And, people are always going to try and gamify, right? You can't get around that. I mean, the goal, the objective is to win. We're going to do everything within our power, within the rules, or sometimes outside of the rules, to accomplish that. And again, you have to look, it's like, well, at what cost? And that's something I recognized in my fight career, where I started off at 155 pounds as an amateur. And just before I turned pro, I realized, like, oh man, based off of how big these other guys are at that level, I probably need to be at 145. And so I spent most of my pro career at 145. Probably took years off of my life, cutting weight in a sauna to just try and, get down low enough to make weight. Definitely didn't perform to my best, because, when you're super dehydrated, from an athletic standpoint, you're not going to be, at peak performance. You can't be, right? And so it's like, well, do I give up a little bit weight, a little bit of class, but then, I'm not as depleted because I don't have to kill myself to make weight. And again, that becomes, the risk management type calculation.
What was the strength and conditioning like for you guys in high school, and then in college? How was it for wrestling specifically?
Archaic. and knowing what I know now, I look at the things that we did. And I think we were using the best knowledge that we had. And it's not a knock on any of our strength and conditioning coaches, because I think those guys did a phenomenal job and they were really good at what they knew. But with a sport like wrestling, with a sport like fighting, trying to apply formulaic notions of performance is you're kind of pissing in the wind a little bit, right? And it's not until recently that I've come to realize just how arbitrary a barbell is for measuring strength, right? In terms of sport performance. And you look at things like football, and it is, again, very formulaic. Like, we know if you're a defensive end, you need to be able to squat this much, bench this much, run this 40, this, and they have all those stats, and they're pretty darn accurate, right? But with something as dynamic as wrestling and fighting as well, you really can't definitively quantify. Yeah, again, there's some benchmarks, right? There's some things where you can look at an athlete and say, okay, you probably are below the threshold of general strength that's going to be required to safely compete in the sport. You got a guy who's an absolute beanpole and can barely support his own, body weight underneath his baby giraffe legs. Like, maybe get that guy under a barbell and have him do some squats, right? But, does he need to be able to back squat 500 pounds? Not necessarily. And I think the hard part, the trap, I think with most strength coaches, unfortunately, is that the number becomes the objective. And,
Yeah.
when truthfully performance is the objective. And for me as a fighter, having a 500-pound back squat means absolutely nothing to my ability to win a fight. And I can say that definitively. It has nothing, my deadlift, my bench, squat, none of these things have directly correlated. Like once you have obtained a certain level of general strength, now you're just chasing a number. So it's not to say that barbell work is bad. And I'm not saying, all right, guys, everybody throw out your freaking barbells, but we get so obsessed with numbers and like, oh man, crap, I didn't hit 84% of my 1 rep max for 3 sets of 5. I guess I'm getting weaker. And it's like, or maybe you didn't sleep good last night. Like, dude, those are just numbers on a paper, man. That it's not, it's too much, we put too much of a premium on that, I think, a lot of times.
Yeah, I feel like the number, it can be just a number, because for you guys, I feel like it's moving your body in performance. It's not necessarily, like you said, squatting 500 pounds. The work that it would take to get there anyway, I feel like that would almost maybe take you away.
Absolutely, for sure. I mean, for me, at 165 pounds, could I build up to a 500-pound back squat? Sure. Have I come pretty close? Yeah, not that far off. So it's feasible. There's guys that are my size that are doing way more than weight than that. But to what end? I mean, what am I accomplishing? I'm becoming so specific now that it's taking away. And let's face it, there's only so much time in a day to begin with. Why, and that's the the trick is figuring out, well, how much time should I allocate for this, that, or the other thing? And you can look at conditioning, you can look at steady rate cardio. It's like, well, yeah, there's probably a certain amount of road work, of running, of cardio, biking, whatever modality you want to choose that I should engage in, because we know that does help build a cardiovascular base. And there is a cardio component to my sport, right? My ability to recover in between rounds is going to be directly related to, how quickly I can bring my heart rate down, which does have correlation to VO2 max. And I mean, you can get as granular as you want with this thing, right? Although VO2 max is also kind of a relative thing that depends on your efficiency, which can affect that. But anyway, that's also not a purely, indicative marker of performance. And that's the thing we really want that like scientific measurement. I want that linear progression chart that I can just follow and say, here you go. It's on the paper, man. All I got to do is hit these numbers and boom, I'm there. And it super doesn't work like that, unfortunately. And so the bar, what is strength? Right? It's your ability to create a contraction, right? To how much muscle contraction, how much muscle fiber recruitment can you generate and exert that on a certain force, right? Well, that force doesn't have to be the barbell, right? It can be isometric and holding a position. It can be against another human, right? It can be against gravity and moving your body. There's so many different facets or ways to express strength. Again, relegating that strictly to a barbell, I think is very limiting.
Yeah, completely agree with that statement. And so if we go back to, so you said you finished with wrestling, you were introduced to MMA. Can you kind of talk about from doing it for fun as a hobby and everything in the beginning to turning pro? What was that like?
The first things first is like, I just need to be, I mean, there's something about me that, like, apparently if I don't physically engage with other people in a quasi violent way, then I don't know. I start to have some issues mentally. Right. And so being off the mat for some time after I finished wrestling, I had to have shoulder surgery, which put me out for a while, and I was getting absolute stir crazy. And, fitnessing and working out, yeah, that's important. But there needs to be some expression of that. Like I found that I couldn't just lift weights to lift. I couldn't just run to run. There needed to be some end game. It needs to be useful in some other way. And the best expression of that is some kind of a combat sport. And so when I found it, it was new, it was different, it was challenging. And I was just, this is super cool. And, back going way back as a young kid, I mean, I don't know if we all had this fantasy, right? But man, watching movies like Bloodsport and all kinds of other different martial arts things out there, it's like, dude, this is peak badassery. Like, Frank Dukes is the baddest dude alive. He's got 200-0, and which is a total fabrication. Like, that thing never happened. But when you're a kid, you don't know that, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I want to be that guy, right? And so I think there was a seed planted there, and so martial arts and wrestling and all of that really kind of scratched that itch. And so it was just learning and appreciating and doing my best to absorb as much as I could in the early days. And so, not knowing that I knew nothing, and having a complete, like, empty cup, going in there and just learning and progressing and getting better, and then being able to test those skills out once I was ready on my teammates and other training partners, seeing some levels of success and building upon that and building upon that. It was like, oh man, I'm not terrible at this thing. I didn't expect to be terrible, but I also didn't, I didn't really know what to expect. I just went in, okay, let's just do this for the sake, with just to enjoy it and see what happens. And so I remember going to my very first live amateur competition to support one of my teammates. And so I watched this guy go out there and compete, and he totally just destroys his opponent. And I'm watching, and I'm just like, man, I feel like I'm pretty competitive with that guy, and he just steamrolled this other dude. It's probably not inconceivable to think that I could go out there and do that my own self, And so from that point, I was like, all right, well, maybe I have something to work for. Maybe I can just, when coach says I'm ready, I'm not going to jump the gun here, but I trust his judgment. He's been in the game for a long time. When that person says, hey man, I think you're ready for this, then let's explore that. And so that's kind of where I was at in about 6 months. I kind of got the nod of like, hey man, we think you can probably do okay in this if you're interested. I was like, yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. So I went out, had my first amateur fight, demolished the guy. Because, it wasn't really, he had about 6 months of training as well, but he didn't have, 4 years of Division I wrestling. He didn't have, a decade prior to that of high school and middle school wrestling either. So I felt a little bit bad because I'm coming into this thing as, like a legitimate athlete, competing against a guy who his very first time being on a mat was 6 months ago. So, but that wasn't for me to decide. You fight the guy who's in front of you, right? And at that point, it was like, all right, well, hey, when can we do the next one? And so a little while, we line up another one, and now we've got a guy who, he's got, I think he had like 2 or 3 fights, and so fought him. That went well. Okay, cool. Let's find somebody else with a little bit more experience or a little bit more. And so my coach did a really good job trying to give me as much of a sampling, right? Like, so it was progressively harder. I've seen it happen where it's like, hey man, this guy's really good. He's got a ton of potential. Here's a dude who's 10-0 for your very first fight. Good luck. And, or he has his first fight against someone who's pretty evenly matched, done really well. Like, oh, this guy's a stud. He's got it. here you go. Here's, the next GSP we're going to put you against. Right. And I've seen that. And so I'm really grateful that my coaches, had a good, slow, steady build of progression and weren't just like, oh, dude, this guy's tough. Here you go. Yeah. Here's the freaking ocean. You just skip right over the deep end and just, throw you off freaking bow in the middle of the Atlantic. Like, they didn't do that, thankfully. And so that was a good thing for my development, I think.
So all of those fights right there, you're still amateur? The ones that you're describing?
Yes. Yeah. So, that was kind of, once you turn pro, you don't have quite as much leeway, right? So the amateur time is really to get as much experience as you can. Because you can be a little bit more choosy with who your opponents are. Once you turn pro, and especially if you're fighting for an organization, I mean, yes, you always have right to refusal, right? But that it is, you kind of build up a bad reputation within with promoters if you're just trying to cherry pick fights all the time and you only fight the people that you can win. Right. And sometimes you're going to get thrown in there with a ringer, and other times, the guy's going to be a freaking tomato can. And you try to make good decisions for your career, but at the same time, especially in the early days, beggars can't be choosers. So the time to really do that is generally as an amateur. And so, went undefeated as an amateur and decided like, man, I think I actually have some potential in this, clearly I don't suck. Let's see how far I can take it. I think, let's go pro. That's the next logical progression. And, even at that point, it wasn't like, okay, I'm going to be a pro fighter. This is how I'm going to earn my living. I mean, yes, that was in the back of my mind of, oh, that would be super cool. But it was still, kind of a hobby at that point. First, probably 2 or 3 professional fights. And then it was like, man, okay, it's time to kind of shit or get off the pot with this thing. And either I need to commit fully and pursue it, or, say, hey, that was cool. This was fun. But, this is as far as I'm going to take it, because at the time I was coaching wrestling and teaching high school. And so it was like,
oh, wow, you're busy.
Yeah. Fairly busy. And also fighting at the time. And so it was like, well, something's got to give. If I'm if I'm going to pursue my teaching career full time, then I need to commit to that. Or if I'm going to pursue this fight thing full time, then I need to commit to that. And at 23 or so, let's see, 2008, I'm not going to do that math right now, but we'll just call it, 23, 24, roughly. It was like, man, I've got the whole rest of my life to teach. I only have a short window that I can compete. Teaching isn't going anywhere. I've got my degree, I've got my teacher cert. Like, I can always come back to it, but to teach for 10 years and then try to jump into fighting probably isn't going to happen. Right. So that was the decision. I talked with my, were we married then? I know we were just engaged. I don't think we were even married at that point, but we were pretty serious at the time, and she is now my wife, and kind of like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. And she was 100% on board. She's like, look, I believe in you. I think that you should pursue this, and I totally support it. And I understand the ups and downs that are going to come along with this. There's going to be a lot of instability financially. And that's something to any would-be fighters that may be listening, that I would say is like, don't get into it for the money. I mean, do it because you love it. And yes, do your best to make money off of the sport, but it is, there's so many better ways to make a living out there. And again, not to dissuade and say, hey man, you might be the next Conor McGregor and make millions of dollars. Right. And for sure, give that a shot, but there's no need to just completely sell out of that at the very early on and say, nope, this is my meal ticket. This is my path. Like, do it because you love it. And if you can transition that, and I use the same advice for starting a business as well, of like, hey man, if you've got a good thing going, you might have a rare, the best idea ever. We have a multi-billion-dollar notion. Get it going a little bit before you just tell your boss to kick rocks. You know what I mean? Like there's some wisdom in burning the ships and selling out. Like I can appreciate that mentality, and it can be useful. It can also be devastating, right? And so if you don't have to, sometimes you do. Sometimes there's no other option, right? And it's like, all right, do or die. But I think we've been kind of not duped, but I think we've just like we've watched too many movies, right? I think Hollywood and fantasy have just concocted this idea of just like, it's all or nothing, man. This Rocky mentality of just, all I got to do is want it more than the other guy and it's going to happen. It's like, man, you can want in one hand and shit in the other and see which one fills up faster. Right. And so take small increments if you can, and build it gradually until you reach that tipping point. I would say that tipping point for me was making the decision to move out to Utah. Right. I built my fighting career from an amateur to a successful amateur with, several belts under his name, to then like, okay, now I'm going to turn pro, to, okay, now it's time to really pursue this thing, before I popped smoke and said, all right, I'm out. And then I left my hometown, moved across the country, and started a whole new life, but the fantasy of it is just like, oh, I'm going to be a fighter. And, day one, first week in the gym, I just quit my job and this is it for me, man. It's do or nothing. If I don't make it into the UFC, I'm going to be destitute and homeless. I'm like, bro, you don't what? I just want, and I've talked to these guys, they've come through the gym and they're like, I just know I'm going to be good at this because I want it. I'm like, man, okay, that's cool, but I hate to break it to you, but you're terrible. You were awful, because everyone who comes in for their first week is terrible. I don't care how tough or how good, you might potentially be. Like, you're day one new guy. Like, you suck. Sorry. Plain and simple fact. Doesn't mean you don't have potential. Doesn't mean you're not tough. Doesn't mean you can't hit hard. Doesn't mean you can't take a punch, but you suck at fighting. I'm sorry. You'll get there, give it time. But, the first week of stepping onto a mat is not to decide this is my life path. Or again, it's your face, it's your life, do what you want. But I don't recommend it from someone who has, walked that path.
It's funny you say burn the ships, because for me personally, that's my mentality. Like, I have to reel it back. So I always appreciate when I hear someone like you say that, because that's my mentality with everything, is burn the ships. So it's nice to hear that you don't necessarily have to do that.
Yeah, I don't think so. Again, there are definitely circumstances where you should. And a lot of people, again, take this advice for what it's worth. I'm not a world champion, right? I never have been, and I probably never will be. And so, if that is your objective, if that is your goal, then maybe you need to follow a different path, and maybe you need to listen to the guy who was and follow in his footsteps. That being said, if you look at most world champions in any one thing, the majority of people cannot do what they did, because you're not that guy, right? And again, that's not to piss on anybody's dreams or their hopes or whatever, but I think, some measure of realism and just, taking it. So I don't think that Michael Jordan woke up one day and said he was going to be the bait and just decided, yep, today I know it now. I'm Michael Jordan and I'm going to be the greatest basketball player of all time. Right? He had a desire to get good. And so he worked super hard at getting good. And each step of the way, he raised that bar a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, until all of a sudden, that bar is so high, he's looking down from a mountain on everyone else that is, that looks like ants below him, because he's risen so high. But he didn't come out of the womb saying, nope, this is it, all basketball all the time. best to ever play the game. It doesn't work that way. But again, when you watch a 90-minute movie, right, that's the story that's being told. And so that's what I think kind of manufacture in our minds of how it's supposed to go. And I don't think it works that way.
Yep. You're 100% right on that. And how did your first pro fight go? Can you kind of take us through that?
Yeah. I mean, it went really well. We had for whatever reason, we had a hard time in finding an opponent. And this is just the nature of the beast. When just early on, my coach gave me some really good advice on my very first, maybe not my first, but I think somewhere around like the second or third amateur fight. And again, it's just part of the sport. He's like, hey, don't get fixated on the idea of fighting this guy, because it's in all likelihood going to change. By the time the fight comes around, the guy that you were originally planning on fighting may not be that guy. And that happened on almost every single fight. I don't know if there was especially in my early days, once I got a little bit further in my career, things were more stable. But it's just a high turnover. Guys get injured, or they decide like, hey, wait a minute, this dude's a Division I wrestler. Oh, no, thanks, I'm out. Right. And you see that, or whatever it was. And so he told me, he's like, hey, don't get too caught up on this guy, which is easy to do. You say, oh, he's this dude and he looks like this and he's got this background, so this is how I'm going to plan my fight. And it's like, oh, just kidding. That short, stocky, 5'3" guy you thought you're going to fighting, he pulled out, and so they found this dude who's 6'5", and well, there's my game plan, just totally shot. So he's like, just be flexible. And so the very first fight they went through, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 different opponents before they finally settled on this kid. And I felt bad because he, again, very much like my very first amateur fight, like he really didn't have any business being in there. He looked like Chuck Liddell's kid brother that, like had the mohawk and everything. He and wasn't even as like well built as Chuck Liddell. And Chuck, has never been known for having the most stellar physique. I mean, the guy's a beast. And again, I'm not shitting on him. He's a great dude and super tough fighter, but he didn't have the physique of like Yoel Romero. Like those are very different looking dudes, right? And this guy was even less so. I mean, he looked like a piece of chewed up bubble gum. But when you go into the fight, you don't know, right? I mean, looks can be deceiving, and I've lost to guys that had no business beating me and looked every bit as unassuming, and I, had made this, and I made the mistake of, judging a book by its cover, letting my guard down, and guys took advantage of that. But went out there and kind of sized them up pretty early and realized, oh, he is exactly what he looks like. There's no hidden whatever. And so went out there and, executed the game plan, punched him a few times, took him down to the ground, beat on him a little bit. And then I think I won that one via rear naked choke. And, outstanding. I mean, like I said, I felt a little bit bad because I liked the idea of constantly upping the ante, and with each fight, fighting someone who had something that I didn't, like a little bit more experience or whatever, like, okay, I'm a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, but this guy's a brown belt, or whatever it was, like something that I knew, like, oh, this is going to definitely be a challenge. And, unfortunately this matchup didn't have that. I mean, going into the fight, I think I was 10-0 as an amateur, and he was like 2-5. So huge disparity. And again, records don't mean everything, but it did in this case. And so, but at the end of the day, I won. I did my job, and, friends, family, everyone's there celebrating. Great way to start off a professional career. It was really cool. I got to go up in the stands to see everybody after the fight. And so I'm up there and I'm hanging out, we're high-fiving and celebrating, everyone's stoked. And guy comes over and he's like, hey man, great fight, dude. That was awesome. I hate to bother you, but like, could you come over and just say hi to these guys real quick? And I was like, yeah, sure. He's like, oh, dude, I appreciate that so much. We're from I don't know, I don't recall the organization, but it was a bunch of combat vets that had been wounded in battle, right? And they were here, they were brought out to the fight, and he was explaining it to me. He said, they're here, they're huge fans of MMA, and I think it would mean a lot just to have one of the fighters come say hey. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. So I go over to these guys, and he takes me over, and I say hi, and they all had different levels of combat disabilities, right? Some were like completely paralyzed and in wheelchairs. Others, were amputees and in different degrees. And I'll always remember that moment, because looking at these guys and seeing the reaction on their face, or having just some peon, right? Like, I mean, I wasn't a well-known name. I wasn't a famous fighter. I was just a guy who went in the cage. No one had ever heard of me to this moment. And, for those guys to be like, man, dude, you're such a badass. That's so awesome. And like me coming in time that did, I'm like, I'm not a badass. Like I went out there and compared to what you guys did, I played patty cake for 5 minutes. You know what I mean? Like there was no danger of me losing a limb. Right? At the end of lose or draw, like I'm still going home to my family, at the end of this. And it's like, that's not badass. That's, like I said, that's patty cake. What you guys did was badass. But to see, that mutual respect really, man, made a huge impression of like, okay, I guess there's something to this fighting that is beyond just beating people up for sport and money, right? I don't know what it is, but I'm like, all right, there's some kind of greater purpose to this thing other than like, well, let's see how freaking, famous I can get at fighting, and how, how many W's I can rack up or whatever. There's more to it than that. And that for me was like a really cool experience of just like, man, I felt really so grateful to have that conversation with those guys, and just, bring even a couple of moments of like excitement to them, and it's for what they did. Cause I didn't serve. I wasn't in the military. Like, and I won't have that opportunity now to serve my country. And so for me to, indirectly serve those guys in that way, I was like, man, I'm really glad, really grateful for that opportunity.
What an honor, like talking to wounded combat veterans and them being that excited to see you. I can't even imagine what you were feeling inside when they were doing. That's awesome.
It was, I'm a young kid, so I really didn't even know what to do with that at the moment,
Yeah.
Other than just like, wow, that was powerful. It wasn't until much later that I was able to kind of process and just like, kind of understand the profundity of that moment. But again, it made a huge impact. And so, a really cool first outing, I have to say.
How many fights did you have in your career?
20 something. 21 total, I think.
20. Is there like this?
And
Gotcha. Is there like this specific way you train, like right before a fight? Like, do you have to peak your conditioning at a certain point, or do you just kind of maintain this baseline level of fitness throughout the entire time you're a fighter?
Yeah, it is really tricky. Unlike a lot of other sports where you have a defined season or competition window, right? If you're an Olympic athlete, well, I know when this is happening, and so I can, kind of adjust my training accordingly. With the fight game, it stuff pops up and you get the call. And so there is a level of maintenance, right? That you just have to, you want to try and maintain like a pretty decent baseline, and then to the best of your ability, try and peak when possible. But again, this was something that I kind of had to learn the hard way, where it's like, man, the likelihood of ever going into any fight at 100% is kind of an illusion. And I really struggled with that, because I was, I very much subscribe to the traditional like periodization training model and deloading and all of this stuff. And man, being super scientific about it. And it's just like, there's too many variables. And the guy who wins on that day isn't necessarily the guy who's in the best shape or had the best training camp, right? I mean, yeah, that helps. And you want to always have as cohesive and consistent training camp as possible. But, that isn't the only factor, right? So really the best thing is just putting yourself in giving yourself the best chance for success with what you have. And I've seen guys, take a fight on 1 week notice with minimal training. And the only objective is just to get down on weight, right? There is no, hey, let's make sure we're peaking and, get our whatever metrics up to this standard. It's just like, nope, we just got to make weight. And I've seen those guys go out and fight better than they've ever fought on a 12-week training camp, And I've seen guys with 12-week training camps go out there and totally shit the bed. I've been that guy. That's just like, all right, man, here's the perfect circumstances, had the perfect camp. Everything is great. And then for whatever reason, well, not for whatever reason, because I actually, trained too much, I put myself in a position to actually underperform. And so it's such a delicate thing. And I think, it's having a coach that can almost intuitively sense that is a rare and difficult thing, right? I think it's next to impossible for a fighter to be able to do that on their own. You need that third person perspective, observing and kind of helping guide, because most fighters, your intuition, your inclination is to go hard. And man, if I feel good, then I'm going to get after it. And if I don't feel good, well, guess what? I'm going to get after it anyway.
Oh, I love that.
And most of us though, and sometimes that's necessary and you have to do it. But other times you need someone to kind of help you step on that, take your foot off the gas pedal for a minute.
And how about as far as like mentally speaking, like when you're walking into a fight, what is going on through your head, like as you're walking into the ring?
Man, I've gone through a lot of different iterations. And maybe a bit over analytical, for good or for bad. I always try to look at things as objectively as I can. And I think that's both my blessing and my curse in a lot of ways. And so, I experimented with a lot of different mentalities and mental states going into fights. Right. And the first couple ones, it was too new to even know what I should or shouldn't do. I remember my very first fight, it being a cakewalk, because I knew for a fact that this guy stood no chance. Like, that was, strangely enough, my very first fight, I probably had maybe some of the least anxiety and apprehension going into the event, because I just knew, I was like, oh, this guy's only been training for 6 months. Sorry about your luck, dude. I'm a friggin' D1 athlete. You know what I mean? Like I've put in more time and more energy than you could ever dream of. Like there's no way that you were more prepared for me. And that supreme confidence, allowed me to just go in and do the thing. But then, as things became more difficult, and the longer you do something, the more you realize like where the danger is. It's like you don't know what you don't know. And the time you get behind the wheel of a car, it's fast, it's fun, you want to do all the cool stuff, right? Until you have that near miss where you almost wrap your car around a telephone pole, or do wrap your car around the telephone pole. And then all of a sudden, if you survive, you realize like, hey, wait a minute, I'm in a freaking stainless steel death machine, screaming down the highway, at 80 miles an hour, surrounded by other death machines. oh, wait a minute, right? And so
Yeah.
sometimes, that comes a little bit later. And so I toyed with different mental states, watching other fighters, listening to other fighters. And it's like, yeah, dude, I want to be that guy that just doesn't care, man. I'm just so cool, like whatever. I'm just going to sit back and I'm just so relaxed and, and that, didn't really get the performance that I wanted. And I realized that I was just wasting mental energy trying to be something that I wasn't, right? Because I was a little bit apprehensive and I did want to get up and move a little bit every once in a while. And instead of fighting that, I realized, well, do it. The other thing that I got really entrenched in was like super dogmatic routine of like, today's fight day, bro. And so now I'm gonna, I've gotta like do my samurai sword blade ceremony. I'm gonna anoint my armor with oil, and I'm gonna read this scripture, or, whatever the, and I tried all these different like routines and borderline superstitious things, thinking that somehow that was going to determine the outcome. And I quickly realized, well, that's not it either. And I paid very close attention to how I felt, what I did, how I felt, and how I performed. And throughout my career, always trying to draw some kind of correlation between the two, and systematically, as best as I could, figure out, okay, what are the keys to my success, right? And I tried being super pissed off, and I was like, dude, if I just get rage angry, who can stop me? I mean, freaking look at the Incredible Hulk. That guy's super pissed, and he's invincible. Well, that didn't work either. Again, another waste of energy, right? I thought that maybe if I spent my entire time just like visualizing, just like going through and seeing the thing, right? Again, wasting energy. Like by the time my fight actually came along, I was so drained because I had mentally gone through the fight dozens of times leading up to it. And so, with all this trial and error of different things and whatever, I finally what I came to, what I realized is like, man, I am not performing in the cage anywhere close to the level that I am capable of in training. And there's a problem there, right? It's like, man, in training, I can hang with anybody. Put a world champion in there, put a guy, 2 or 3 weight classes above me, and I can hold my own, right? And then, I go out and I can barely beat a guy who, is nowhere near that level. How does that happen? There's something up here that's amiss. And so I started troubleshooting. It's like, well, what's different? When I go to the gym and I train and we have a sparring day, I don't have any rituals. I don't have any seances that I conduct. I don't burn incense. I don't have this elaborate warm-up stretching routine. You know what I do every single day when I go into spar? I walk in, I set my bag down, I take a sip of water, I put my mouthpiece in, my gloves on, and I walk on the mat and I start punching somebody. There's no warm-up, there's no stretching. I mean, that not saying that that's recommended or anyone should do that, but that is what I did every single day, 5-6 days a week. Well, why on the one day that it actually matters am I going to completely do something entirely different, right? And I realized, like, man, my body, of course my body's not going to perform. I just threw it a massive curveball, right? It's just like, whoa, hey man, something's different. Of course I'm going to have added anxiety. Of course I'm going to have, a bunch of extra tension and feel super drained, right? Because like my body is freaking out because I've just disrupted the system. And so when I started applying that, my performance increased and my anxiety decreased. And, the other thing that I recognized too was like, man, instead of spending all this mental energy trying to control my mind for, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours before I went out to compete. I mean, when you're the main event of a show and the show starts, you know, the gates open at like 5 or 6, you might not be fighting until, you know, 11 o'clock at night, you know, or later. I mean, there's been times where I've shown up at a venue and not competed until almost midnight, right?
Oof.
That's a long time to just sit there and, you know, okay, mind, only think about the fight, be in this box. Like, it's, you know, it's not conducive. So recognizing like, hey, the only time I need to be dialed in is when the ref says go, right? Like, there's no sense in being ready to fight 4, 3, 2, 1 hour prior. There's no reason being ready to like fight that dude standing at the other end of the tunnel, right? I'm gonna walk through, and this is the other thing too of like this, my own personal struggle of like, what do I look like to everyone? All right, do I need to look like I'm like, again, super tough and I'm angry and like, oh man, this guy's gonna kill this dude, or do I need to look super relaxed and like I don't even care? I mean, these are, again, I mean, from a guy who's spent way too much time in his own head, and I hope, you know, this is something that is a very foreign concept to the people who are listening. Like, I don't know, man, I don't think like that. This dude's clearly a freaking weirdo. I hope that's the case, because I don't wish that upon anyone else, but I suspect that other people, at least at some point, have suffered from a same level of like, you know, self-consciousness inside their own head, you know, paralysis by analysis, cerebral overload. And again, I realized like none of that stuff mattered. Like, just being in the moment, being present of like, you know what, man, I'm going to enjoy listening to my walkout music. Right. And as I'm walking, I'm gonna engage with my friends and family or strangers, whoever, that are here watching the crowd, because that's what I like. And I'm gonna just take my sweet time, taking my stuff off, and not gonna worry about if I fumble with, you know, taking my shoe or my shirt gets stuck. None of that shit matters, right? And I go out there and I you know, go through the walk. I make eye contact with that guy just like I would, you know, if I'm sparring in competition, and I wait until it says go, and then we're in it. And once you're, and that's the thing, and once I realized is like, once you're in it, everything else goes away, right? Because you're doing the thing. And you're, you know, I think in most cases, you're there. You can't help but be present. When someone's trying to punch or kick you in the face, you're super present until you're not. In which, and also in that circumstance, well, guess what? Your ass is asleep, so it doesn't matter anyway. And the fight's over. There's nothing you can do about it. So there's no use in having the anxiety. It doesn't make it go away, but understanding like, well, this isn't doing me any good. So, you know, there's not the less I can entertain it, the better off I'm going to be. And so just being present and knowing, for me personally, okay, well, I don't have to do any like, you know, warm up kind of thing. I just need to have my hands up, and when he says ready to go, let's go, because that's what I do every single day of the week. That was huge, and my performance, you know, really reflected that. Unfortunately, it was a little bit later in my career that I, you know, would have liked to have come to that realization, but, you know, better late than never, I suppose.
Right. So you're teaching, you're wrestling, then eventually you're a pro fighter. So you did all that. When did Savage Gentleman come along? And then if you can kind of tell everyone what your mission is with that.
Yeah. Sorry, we spent a lot of time on the fighting stuff.
Oh, I love that stuff though.
Yeah. So probably, I'd say a little bit over midway through my professional career, my wife and I had our first child, and I quickly realized that, oh, this kind of changes things a little bit in this very like carefree, hey, you know, we'll get by however, whatever it takes to get by, you know, and you know, we'll just make it work. Kind of, you know, was turned on its head, where it's like, hey man, I can't just wait until maybe possibly some fight happens to come along for me to make a couple of grand, you know. We need something a little bit more reliable than that. And so it just so happened that I was introduced to some guys that were doing some really cool things, and they gave me the opportunity to start helping them out and working for them. And so they're in the e-commerce business, doing online sales, and I was fortunate enough to learn a lot of marketing, a lot of different pieces of the industry with those guys while I was still fighting, while I was effectively a stay-at-home dad. So I bring my daughter to work with me with these guys during the day, and I'd train a little bit. We had a gym on site, so I'd get some training in while she would take her nap, and then I'd my wife after she got home with work, and then go spend the rest of the evening training, so I could still compete and pursue my career. But I knew, like, well, one, I need some more reliability, and two, fighting is not sustainable. Like, you can't do it indefinitely. And so what's after fighting, right? And recognizing, like, well, I'd love to be the next, you know, big thing, and become the, world UFC champion, or some other, high level organization world champion, and make millions of dollars. But what if I don't? What's my contingency plan here? And so that's kind of what led me into actually getting a job, as it were. And fortunately for me, there was a ton of flexibility in the work that I was doing. I mean, the fact that they let me bring my infant daughter there probably speaks quite a bit to that. And so, again, very, very fortunate in my circumstances that I was able to do that, which allowed me to still continue training and fighting. And, seeing what they were doing, but seeing that there was another, like, niche that wasn't being filled there, kind of sparked this idea of, like, hey, I think that there's some room here for me to interject some of my skill set and ideas, right? And so there was an adjacent podcast that started up, because at the time the company I was working for was, like, very much in, like, the preparedness into the world, like, space of, like, hey, here's, got to make sure you have, this much ammo, and you got this much food storage, and here's your bug out bag, and, all of that stuff. And, I'm really big into survival. I think there's a lot of overlap in wilderness survival skills and fighting, and just the notion of self-reliance, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. Personally, the direction they wanted to take the company was like, man, I'm not that into it. Like, I'm not in a place where I'm, ready to start building ham radios and hoarding resources yet. I mean, we might get there. And I'm not saying that it's not a useful skill. If you're into it, great. But it wasn't me. But what I saw is they were teaching guys, and they were building skills. They were teaching guys how to use firearms, how to build fires, how to do all these very different things that allow for self-reliance and independence and that sort of thing. And by virtue of teaching these skills, I saw a profound change occurring. And I realized there's something here. There's something to that. If you can endow a man with an ability that he didn't have before, and give him that confidence, you can elicit some really, impactful change, both, in the skill itself, but also just in the psyche and overall quality of life. And I saw so many guys coming through that just, man, were miserable and hated their circumstances. And one of the reoccurring themes was that there was something missing. There was some side aspect of their life. And I later came to realize that this idea of a savage gentleman is, like, the thing that they were missing was either the savage or the gentleman. Right. And we've become way too one dimensional, where guys pick a path and they just pursue that, as far as they possibly can. And they almost completely neglect the other aspect. And it's like, man, we're multifaceted individuals. And if you're living your life in only one realm, you're probably not going to be happy. It's not going to be very fulfilling. And you're going to wake up one morning and you're going to look around and realize that even though you have the car and the house and the job and, you know, you've checked all the boxes, somewhere deep down inside, you're not satisfied. And the conclusion that I came to is like, well, you have neglected either your savage or your gentleman side. And I realized that that was the case in myself, right? In pursuing my fight career, I was very much, you know, for a very long time exploring the savage. And it wasn't until I started working for this company and doing video editing and writing blog articles and doing all this creative stuff. And I was like, oh yeah, I do have this like creative, like more intellectual side that I've completely just negated, right? I've just set that down. When I was a kid, I used to love all that stuff. You know, I like to sing. I like music. I like art. I like all this stuff. And I completely, you know, set that aside to pursue fighting. And it's like, man, I've spent all this time destroying and I've stopped creating. And once I started doing that, I realized, oh, this is that thing that was missing. And I felt way more complete. And it occurred to me like, well, how many other guys are experiencing something similar? You know, what if we could help them fill in those gaps, whatever they are? And I can't define that for anyone else. That's for you to figure out, you know, what areas might need improving. But man, if you've been doing the same thing and getting the same results, maybe it's time to look, you know, ask the last time I got my hands dirty. When's the last time, you know, I turned a wrench, or when's the last time, you know, I got punched in the face? Or on the other side, it's like, man, when's the last time I read a book or, you know, played the guitar or whatever, right? You see, you know, it's either or, but, you know, this idea of like, man, the Renaissance man, it's nothing new. I don't claim to have invented the idea. It's something that I think has been, you know, pondered upon since we first came, you know, crawled out of the caves, right? This idea of like, man, we need to be well-rounded. Like there's no reason why we shouldn't. And so that was kind of the birth of like, okay, there's something to this savage gentleman idea. And so we started a podcast as an adjacent piece to the company I was working for. And I saw just, man, how quickly it resonated with people. And I'm like, there's something here. There's something to this. And so, you know, with their blessing, we kind of took it and turned it into its own thing and set out, you know, and my business partner and I, and created this. And, you know, now here we are with it. And that's kind of the very, very long and in-depth evolution of how that came to be.
So it started as a podcast.
Yep.
And then what were kind of the next steps for your brand after that?
Well, I mean, the podcast, you know, people seem to be interested in it. They like the idea of it. So it's like, well, I don't know how to monetize a podcast. You know, I'm not at the point where people are going to pay me to hear me run my suck. You know, I don't know if they ever will. Maybe they won't. But, you know, it's like, well, how do we put food on the table with this thing? We've got this idea and people like it. What do we do with it? And the only answer that my business partner and I could come up with is like, well, we got to sell stuff. Obviously. I mean, e-commerce is the way of the future, right? People buy stuff online. And so let's make stuff. And we understood that market because that's what the company we were working for. That's what we were doing. He was on the, you know, more on the product development and fulfillment side. I was on the creative side and marketing side. And so between the two of us, yeah, I think we can probably fumble our way through this and make it happen. Cool. What should we sell? Good question. And my initial thought was like, well, let's just find cool stuff that we like, and we'll buy it wholesale and then, you know, sell it retail. And he was like, well, yeah, we could probably do that. He's like, but what if we just make stuff? I mean, the margins are way better. And I'm like, yeah. And he's got my partner, he's got a manufacturing background. So, I mean, that's his thing. Like he gets super geeked out on, you know, on making stuff. I was like, sure, cool, love it. What are we gonna make? And, you know, we were like, well, something about leather seems to be really fitting for savage gentlemen, right? Because leather is both very, very rustic and primal and primitive, but at the same time, it can be super classy and refined and sophisticated. And so it I think, embodies that dichotomy of both savage and gentleman in a physical, tangible product. So it's like, yeah, cool, leather. Well, what can we make out of leather? We came across an idea for like just little basic like card holder wallet, like super simple, 2 flaps of leather, stitch it on the bottom 3 sides, slide your cards in, boom. Okay, well, let's figure out how to work a sewing machine and what it takes. And so we went through the process, and there was obviously some refinement, and we started off with just super basic wallets and obviously t-shirts. I mean, hey, here's a design. This is one of the very first t-shirts that we came out. We don't even sell this shirt anymore. And it's like, I don't know, just put slap Savage Gentleman on a black t-shirt. People will probably buy it. Oh, cool. And I remember the early days where it's like, man, if we did $100 in our store, we were like, holy crap, dude, we're killing it. This is amazing. We're gonna, we're on to something. And that wasn't that long ago. I mean, that was probably 3 years or so when when we were having that thought. And so obviously we've come a much longer way, and we've continued to expand our product line, refine our process, hopefully get better. I think we've gotten much better at our craft. And we've released an apparel line. My wife's a designer. She went to art school for fashion, and so she built our Hemingway collection from the ground up. It wasn't, these aren't products that we just like, oh, hey, cool, that's neat, let's get those and put our name on it. It's like, no, these were like designed from the ground up with every detail in mind. And so, we're working on building that and expanding it, and just, continue to grow in as many ways as we can.
I was telling you this a little bit offline, and my wife too, a few days ago. Just Savage Gentleman is the perfect dichotomy, if there is one. And I just love both sides of that coin. And as I told you before, that's what I'm striving to be one day. So I just think what you guys are doing is amazing. I love that gap that you're really filling.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. It goes a long way to hear that like-minded individuals like appreciate what you're doing, because you always wonder, like, all right, man, is this a good idea? Do people understand the vision? Are we delivering this message in a way that actually is being received how we want it to? So it's always great to hear that. And I mean, the idea of a Savage Gentleman, that's what I'm aspiring to be as well. I think it's a good paradigm, you know what I mean, or a model to follow. I mean, because it's very aspirational, right?
Yeah.
It can transcend a lot of different definitions, because you can define what a Savage Gentleman is to you. And it's an ever evolving process, right? So as I level up my savage, then my goal is to have my gentleman, match. And then it's just this constant journey of self-improvement that I think is really important. And unfortunately, it would seem a lot of guys have, and it's easy to do, to get sidetracked from that. It's like, well, I've reached this level, whatever that level is, and I'm done. Right. And I'm a firm believer that, man, complacency kills. The second we
100%.
stop this, the second we stop evolving in some facet. And that's not to say that all right, man, every month, if you're not PR and you're a piece of shit, it's like, look, if you want to be David Goggins, be David Goggins, that's fine. But I don't know that that's, the right path for everyone. Is just like, just keep pushing harder and break yourself. It's like, well, maybe, but that doesn't mean that we can't improve, right? You don't have to just pick one facet and kill yourself in it. It's like, cool, man. Maybe I've maxed out on what I can do on my long distance running for a while. So maybe let's, figuring out like where's the benefit and what am I getting out of it, and making sure if things feel off, I go back and I look and I'm like, man, when's the last time I did something savage, right? Or if I've been hammering down on the savage and, I'm not gaining any ground, I'm not anywhere closer to where I want to be. And it's like, well, wait a minute, when's the last time I did, one of these gentleman endeavors, right? That and I think it's easy to forget. Again, we get very single track mind because, we see guys that are out there and they're crushing it in their respective fields, doing their thing. And I'm beating up on David Goggins just because he's a well-known entity and everyone kind of understands his mentality. But I don't think that works for everyone, right? It works great for him, and the dude's crushing it. And, that guy can do a lot of stuff that most humans can't. But again, just, a very narrow mentality, I think is to potentially set yourself up for failure. Right. I think again, some critical thinking and like being a little bit more introspective and looking at stuff objectively of like, is this actually working for me? I mean, I know it's what Gary Vee said, or I know that this is the thing that I read, but again, is this actually making sense, or has it concluded its futility? And that's not, again, I don't want people to say, well, just keep the second something isn't working, shift gears, change lanes, do something different. I'm not saying that either. But if for the last 5 years, you've been doing the exact same thing and you're nowhere closer to where you want to be, it might be worth looking into some of the other areas that you have neglected, right? And a lot of guys, I think that's even being presumptuous, that they even have put much thought into where they want to be. I sadly, I think there's a lot of guys that really are kind of just, where I'm here, and I don't know. I mean, I just want to make sure I can, make my car payment next month. And I've been there. I know what that feels like. But I think it's important to also have some longer term big picture and not sell yourself short of like, well, this is just me. Here I am. I'm this guy because everyone has always told me that I was the short kid in class, and I'm just going to be the short kid for the rest of my life. And it's like, well, guess what? I can't change my height, but I can change the way I define myself, right? Yeah. I can be the short jacked dude. I can be the short, super fast dude. I can be the short, really smart, really talented. What, you know what I mean? Like, pick whatever. I mean, yeah, there's certain aspects about ourselves that we can't change, but damn, there is a lot that we can.
Yeah. And you said kind of in the beginning of all that you hope people receive your message. That was another thing that I loved. I knew what you were saying right away. Like when I look into other brands or companies, I want to know their message and what they're doing. And sometimes it's not clear, but with what you are presenting, it's crystal clear. So that was one of my other favorite things that I wanted to say about you guys. So
and again, I do appreciate that, because I mean, we've been chatting here and man, I can really talk a lot, and sometimes I'll kind of talk in circles or run down rabbit holes. And I one of the things that I've noticed that I need to work on myself is trying to be a little bit more concise.
It's hard.
I can be a bit self-indulgent and just, go off and yeah, that's fun sometimes, and it makes for, interesting dialogue. But at the same time, man, people have short attention spans, and sometimes, man, you got to get right to the point. And that's something that I've recently realized, like, we could probably be better about that. Let's, try to pay more attention. And that is the point, is, again, I'm constantly evolving. And I think that we all need to be doing that. It's easy to look and see, here's a guy with a podcast, man. He knows some stuff about some stuff, that guy's got it all figured out. And I know, and so people can look to you and say, yeah, man, this guy, and they don't realize we're all still trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure it out. You're trying to figure it out. The guys who I look up to, in business, they're still trying to figure out. At the end of the day, we're all just dudes. And there's not that much separating one from the other, right? Certainly there's some opportunity, there's some work, there's some natural talent, but man, the potential, I think, in everyone is much higher than we often give ourselves credit for. And so my goal with Savage Gentleman is for it to be that inspiration to, like, and that gentle reminder of, like, hey man, we continue to be better, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to hate yourself necessarily, Maybe you do because you suck. No, it's I don't think having a self-deprecating mentality is useful either. But it's like complacency kills, right? Just being constantly content and not realizing that, like, man, there's levels to this thing, and there's so much to experience in life, and the more we have in our arsenal, skill set wise, intellect wise, whatever, the more we're going to be able to experience in life, right? If you can only see one color, things are kind of boring. If you can only see in primary colors, well, that's still a pretty small lens. But man, when you open up to the full color spectrum, the way you experience, and I'm sorry to anyone out here who's listening and is colorblind. It was very this is kind of a kick in the nuts, and I apologize. But just trying to paint an analogy here of, man, that's just one sense, right? There's so many other senses. There's so many other ways to experience the world. But if we limit ourselves to just the savage experience, or just the gentleman experience, or just the fill in the blank experience, man, there's a on.
And if anyone is looking to connect with you, or if they want to purchase some Savage Gentleman products, where would they go and do those things?
So the easiest way to get to what we're doing, if that's products, if you want to just kind of read some of my ramblings or listen to some of the other podcasts and that sort of thing, savagegentleman.com is the place to do that. That's our main website. And then you can follow us on Facebook. We have a closed Facebook group called the League of Savage Gentlemen. And we the idea behind that is to get a little bit more hands-on and try and help guys get to where it is they're trying to go. We've got a ton of really squared away dudes in there that have a wealth of knowledge and of experience and are willing to share, to mentor and be mentored, right? It's a two-way street, right? Where, look, we all have something that we're not amazing at. And I think just about every dude out there, would want to be better at something. And so at 16,000 or so dudes, there's a wealth of knowledge. And so, I invite your listeners to come in and we've got a couple of questions. It's not a huge barrier to entry, but I do like to see that people actually, are willing to put a little bit of effort in. So you do have to request membership, and I do, there's a couple of questions to answer. And so encourage you to check that out. We do Instagram as well, Savage Gentleman Official, if that's more your cup of tea. You can connect with me personally. I have my own Instagram. It's Josh Tyler MMA. So at Josh Tyler MMA is my own thing. If it's probably a little bit weirder than what I put on Savage Gentleman proper. If you're into that sort of thing, you may have judged by listening, like, that's an interesting kind of dude. And if you're into that sort of thing, then, that's a place you can go and to kind of experience some of that in real time. And any other way you want to get a hold of me, feel free. I mean, shoot me a message, find me somewhere. I'm happy to talk. And if you're, want to explore this idea of Savage Gentleman, by all means, we're happy to have you. So, just come find me.
Awesome. I will definitely be linking those in the show description for all the listeners. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the Mission Driven Made podcast. As always, if you found value in today's episode, which I know you did, go ahead and subscribe to the show and leave us a 5-star review. And Josh, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be on the show, because you brought so much value to all the listeners, and I appreciate it a lot. And until next time, everyone, stay mission driven. And done.